All I could see was there are virtually none. They're virtually gone. Where are all the fur seals? Where have they all gone? The beach used to be black with animals. You know, you wouldn't even be able to see the sand.
Hello and welcome to Tipping the Iceberg. I'm your host, Silja Zimmermann, and I invite you to join me on a journey to explore the food system of St. Paul Island. Before we start, a short disclaimer. In this episode, we learn about food insecurity in indigenous communities and why transformative change is needed from a Western scientific perspective. If this isn't relevant to you, you can skip this episode to dive right into life on St. Paul. St. Paul Island is one of the 5 Pribilof Islands in the Bering Sea. St. Paul and St. George Island are home to 2 Aleut or Unangach communities. The other 3, Otter Island, Walrus Island, and Sea Lion Rock, are uninhabited. 300 miles from the Alaskan mainland and 800 miles from Anchorage, the closest urban center, St. Paul is the permanent home to around 300 people. Let me ask you something. What do you see when you close your eyes and imagine the world 50 years from now? Do you see large, thriving forests, pristine ecosystems, and clean and healthy oceans? Do you see a beautiful sunset at the end of a long summer day? You probably don't. You likely have an image in your mind that looks more like this: clear-cut forests, fires, floods, environmental degradation. This is what most of us see when we think about the future. And I can't blame you. How could it be different with all the shocking news about climate change, environmental catastrophes, and collapsing wildlife populations? When we open our laptops, turn on the TV, or pick up our mobile phones, we are bombarded with terrible news that all seem to paint the same picture. The picture of a future that does not look rosy. Not for our planet, not for our ecosystems, and not for us humans either.
We're seeing many environmental crises. I think 2 of the most prominent ones of today are climate change and the biodiversity crisis. So biodiversity is being lost all over the world. And while we know this for decades, we have not been able yet to kind of bring this to a halt.
Who you are listening to is Dr. Ine Dorestein. Ine is an associate professor at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University in the Netherlands.
Well, I think there's many different reasons of why we are in these crises or why we don't seem to be able to get out of them. One of them, for example, could be that they're not a priority for policy or actions. The other one is we are treating the symptoms and we're not really treating the causes or the roots of those problems. So to get out of it, we really need transformative change. And it really means doing things differently. So not just doing a little bit of what we're already doing or doing things a little bit differently, but really having some kind of radical change. So we need new systems. Perhaps we need new social norms. We need new policies. We need new legal frameworks. So it's really about doing things differently.
In her research, Ine focuses on the role of human environment systems in how we can enable transformative change toward a more sustainable future. Ine is also my promoter. And this is probably the point where I should introduce myself as well. I'm a PhD researcher, and as a scientist like Ine, I am overly aware of the numerous environmental crises our world is facing. I'm also an activist. I protest against climate change, the fossil fuel industry, and all the things I find unfair in our world. Knowing quite well about the state of emergency we are in can be scary. So I realized I don't want to contribute to increasingly daunting, accurate predictions of our future. I want to find solutions. I want transformative change.
So positive stories are really important. Stories are super powerful. They can really help you imagine things. It's a way to communicate. And the danger with stories can be that if we're focusing on what's going wrong, like all these different crises that we see, these are all negative stories. And if we keep on focusing on these negative stories, then we risk creating some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So if we start to believe that this is the way, then it's very difficult to get out of it. And in that way, positive stories can really help creating a different future by imagining a better future and by being inspiring and providing hope to people.
So what Ine is saying is, if we keep on having mostly negative visions of the future, it is more likely that they become a reality, even if we know that they are not the ones that we want. It's like steering a car. We are steering towards what we're looking at.
So the project is about Arctic indigenous communities and how they can navigate a changing Arctic environment. So with climate change, but also other environmental stressors, the Arctic is really rapidly changing, and this causes a lot of problems for the community that live in this environment. It, for example, affects their food security. And what we're doing in this project is that we're looking at one community in specific in the subarctic on St. Paul Island. It's one of the Pribilof Islands. And in this project, we are trying to understand their food system. The food system has become more food insecure over time, and we're trying to understand what led to these problems. They're often quite complex. There's lots of different challenges that are linked to each other, and we're really trying to kind of get to the roots of this. But also especially to think about ways forward. So how can we navigate these challenges and how can we reach a better future?
We want solutions. But if we know what the problems are, why is it so difficult to solve them, to achieve fundamental change? And how can we succeed nonetheless?
In the Tipping the Iceberg project, you can first think of the iceberg as some kind of a metaphor. So when you think about an iceberg, there is a little tip above the water, and then the largest part of the iceberg is below water. And often we only see the tip because that is visible. So these are the problems that we are seeing easily. And then maybe you have the tendency to also react to the problems that you see. And what you get is that you're often maybe treating the symptoms, but you're not actually getting to the root causes of a problem. And these root causes of the problem, you can imagine them as the bottom part of the iceberg. So the part that is underwater, that you cannot see. Yeah, often you just react to what we can see. And you also see that policymakers often just react to what is visible. But then you're treating symptoms, for example, by inducing taxes or providing subsidies. But with this project, we're really trying to tackle the root causes and kind of tip the iceberg by creating a different future by really looking at what is underneath the surface.
I like this iceberg metaphor. And it makes sense what Ine says. It's no use repairing the roof if the whole foundation is broken. We need to unearth the foundation of this broken system and then come up with solutions right there.
So why are these projects so relevant? Because there is a need to think about change, and there is a need to kind of improve the current situation. And in this project, we are kind of combining different types of knowledge. So scientific knowledge together with indigenous knowledge to seek, different pathways to the future. And it's also really important to take into account the local food system, because what we see in a globalized world, or when food systems become more global and you have way more connections outside of your local food systems, that you become dependent. So then you also become dependent on changing food prices, for example. So you have much less control over your own food system or over what you eat. And that's why it's important to really focus also on local food systems, understand these food systems and see, okay, what kind of changes can we together think about to create a more positive future. So on a global scale, what we are witnessing are many challenges that we should deal with. And inducing transformative change is really difficult. And what I think is really important, that if we really want to strive for a more sustainable world at the global level, is that we are collecting as many examples of places where transformative change ideas are originating or where transformative change is already happening. And I think this case study on St. Paul Island contributes to the overall knowledge of how can we move towards a more sustainable food system.
So together with the St. Paul Island community, we want to get to the roots of the challenges in their food system. We want to work out realistic solutions to be able to look more optimistically into the future. And by learning throughout that process, preferably also contribute to solving various global crises. Phew, quite ambitious if you ask me. But sure, I'm always up for a good challenge. But before we start, we need to create some common understanding. What is a food system? And what does food security really mean? To answer these questions, I meet Dr. Ruby Freed.
My name is Ruby Freed, and I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska. I was born there, and then after high school, I went to a couple different places in the lower 48. But I am now an assistant professor at University of Alaska Anchorage, where I am mostly involved in research, a little bit of teaching here and there, but mostly research in the Institute for Circumpolar Health Studies.
Like Ina and I, Ruby also researches the food system on St. Paul Island. What exactly she's interested in, she explains to me like this.
When I'm working on St. Paul Island, my main research focus is traditional food security, which means, traditional food access, traditional food use, whether or not people are eating traditional foods, how they are getting them, what kind of barriers they experience to getting traditional foods, and also how, the community and other people in the community help support skill building and helping folks get out there to get their own traditional foods.
When I speak to other researchers or scientists, we often use all kinds of terminology that may be normal for us, but can sound pretty cryptic for everyone outside of science. So I want Ruby to explain some of these terms.
I think there are a lot of important elements to the St. Paul food system. One being, of course, traditional and subsistence foods. Our survey said that 72% of people rely on traditional and subsistence foods to get the foods that they want and need for themselves and their family. But the local store is also a very important source of food on island, which will come to no surprise to anybody who lives here. But we found that 100% of people rely on the local store for food here in St. Paul, at least of those surveyed. Another interesting thing that we found in our survey was that 63% of the people that we surveyed also rely on online orders from Amazon, Target, Walmart, those places that often either offer low shipping or no shipping costs. And those are anecdotally, in my understanding, often more shelf-stable items like flour and sugar, kind of the basics that won't necessarily go bad in your pantry, at least, for a year or two.
In other words, the food system on St. Paul Island is a mix between subsistence and cash. That means that both food items that can be purchased online or at a store and subsistence foods contribute to local food security. Food security, another one of those terms. But what exactly does food security mean?
Food security in general has been a concept that's been used by Western scientists to understand access, availability, and use of food in general. But the problem with only utilizing those types of measures in a place like St. Paul is because they really only primarily focus on store-bought food. Obviously, food in St. Paul is different, where you have, of course, a mix of store-bought foods, but then you also have subsistence and traditional foods, where people are sharing those more in the community. They are not necessarily going and buying them. They are, utilizing their own knowledge and skills, traditional knowledge and skills, to go out and get seals, to go out and get halibut, to go out and get sea lions. And those are really, really important, highly nutritious sources of food that the USDA, or the United States Department of Agriculture's measurement of food security, does not capture at all, because they're primarily really focusing on store-bought foods.
So, when Western scientific concepts of food security are applied to indigenous life realities, they often fail to grasp all important descriptors of life in these communities. While in my world, I buy almost 100% of the food I consume from the supermarket, in many native communities, subsistence food and traditional practices around them play just as important a role. And this definition of food security really holds the understanding that without food sovereignty, food security does not exist.
I think food security and food sovereignty are both really important concepts. Food security is more on an individual or family level basis, generally speaking, whereas food sovereignty often talks about how groups of people are able to make decisions about their own food sources. I think on St. Paul, you can see this through the tribe organizing the seal harvest, advocating for different hunting regulations and timing for reindeer, and also making sure that seal pup harvest can still happen. Those are all examples of food sovereignty that are happening on St. Paul, because it's St. Paul residents and the community deciding what foods are important and necessary for them, rather than having the U.S. government or some other external entity deciding what types of foods are important and necessary for St. Paul residents.
The Inuit Circumpolar Council Alaska defines it like this: food sovereignty is the right of indigenous communities to define their own hunting, gathering, fishing, land, and water policies. The right to define what is sustainable and appropriate for the distribution of food, and to maintain ecological health. Also, the right to obtain and maintain practices that ensure access to tools needed to obtain, process, store, and consume traditional foods. In other words, food sovereignty is necessary to support and maintain food security.
Indigenous households in the United States of America, on average, do experience higher levels of food insecurity than non-Indigenous households in the U.S. And those are statistics that are often largely based on Indigenous people living in the lower 48, or American Indians or Native Americans. And that data does not always include very good data for Alaska Native households. We do see that there are higher levels of food insecurity for Alaska Native households in Alaska also. So we saw a big increase in food insecurity during the pandemic because of higher food prices, less ability oftentimes to go out and get food from the land. But again, as I was talking about earlier, the difference between food security and the ways that it is measured normally, and then traditional food security, the way that food security is measured normally does not often account for subsistence or traditional foods. So it's really hard to interpret food security data in Alaska, but we can say that food prices in rural areas are obviously much higher than in urban areas, which can and is known to contribute to food insecurity. We found that food insecurity among Alaska Native households in rural Alaska during COVID increased significantly. Measures of food insecurity increased significantly in terms of store-bought foods, but traditional foods were comparatively less impacted. So traditional foods are this group of food that is a potential arena for resilience and the ability to kind of make up for some shortfalls in terms of, you know, affordable foods from the store. But I would like to say that that is very dependent on what family you're in, what kind of resources you have, if you have a hunter or fisher person in the household, if you're able and willing and knowledgeable enough to get traditional foods.
So, generally speaking, food insecurity rates in indigenous households across America, including the state of Alaska, are high. But what's the situation like on St. Paul Island specifically?
I think some of the food security challenges on St. Paul are similar to a lot of the food security challenges that are happening in a lot of other parts of Alaska, rural Alaska in particular, where we see, like I mentioned earlier, really high food prices, not being able to access fresh fruits and vegetables on a reliable basis, and even when you can, they're really expensive and or they go bad really, really quickly once they get into the community. I would say that those are two really big store-bought food-related issues, in addition to high costs of shipping. In terms of traditional foods, I've heard and talked to a lot of people worrying that younger people are not learning how to get subsistence or traditional foods. Another main area of concern for accessing traditional foods is the competition between 8 to 5 jobs and also childcare, and being able to have the time and energy to go out to gather and hunt and to fish. So obviously everybody only has 24 hours in a day, and if it is not built into the cadence of the community or into the habits of the community to allow people to take time off right when they need to take time off, when they hear the reindeer herd is close to town, or when the seals are coming in, or when the sea lions are closer to shore, those things have a major impact on whether or not people have, like I said, the time and energy to be able to go out and get subsistence foods.
So there are community concerns about local food security on St. Paul, and that in all parts of the food system, regarding foods purchased at the local store or online, and regarding traditional foods.
I think one really bright thing about St. Paul also is that people really want to eat their traditional foods. In the survey that we did last year, 78% of the people that we surveyed, which was around 35 or 40 folks here, said that they would prefer to eat more foods from traditional or subsistence food sources. So I think the desire is there, which is the first step in making sure that those opportunities are available to folks. If people aren't interested in it, that's really difficult to change, but a lot of people living in St. Paul are really interested in it.
What I take from speaking to Ruby is this: Indigenous food security is a lifeline. It's much more than just calories or nutrients. It's a connection between the past and today's self. It's a lifeline throughout Indigenous people's culture. Access to subsistence foods is important, always. However, subsistence foods are even more important when the availability of and access to store-bought foods is limited because of other challenges like maybe COVID-19, inflation, or Russia's war in Ukraine. If food security reflects the health of an entire Arctic ecosystem, food insecurity shows there must be something seriously wrong. I want to learn more about the challenges the St. Paul Island community faces in its food system, not only from the human side of things, but also from the ecological side. And therefore, I meet Lauren Devine.
I am Lauren Devine, and I direct the Ecosystem Conservation Office for the Tribal Government of St. Paul. ECO is the Ecosystem Conservation Office. It is a department of the tribal government. You could think of it like a natural resources department or a wildlife department in any state or with our federal government here in the United States. So we manage our natural resources and complete kind of wildlife management type tasks like a state agency or a federal government agency would do, but it's on behalf of and for the tribal members of the Aleut community of St. Paul, which is the federally recognized tribe of Unangan or Aleut people that live on St. Paul Island.
Lauren has worked with the community for many years. I want to know from her why food security is such an important topic on St. Paul.
The food security on St. Paul is really interesting because you're dealing with a quite remote location, but it's also a harsh environment. So it's kind of at the interface of the subarctic and Arctic. It's not a tropical environment. It's very hard to grow a lot of foods that we would maybe traditionally think of in more urban areas or even in less cold climates. There are amazing food sources. The island is a rich and biodiverse place. There are plenty of food resources that have been utilized, for millennia. However, there's a lack of control in accessing those and determining and maintaining connections to those when you think about the rapid rate of change of the climate. It is nothing that the residents of St. Paul can do to stop those changes. If a species of crab crashes, there's nothing they can do to regain that access to that resource, right? If a fish species disappears and moves out of the habitat that they can fish with, the gear that they have, then there's just no accessing that resource. And so I think the vulnerability comes from there's a lack of control of access to the resources. And so you also then have this added complexity of it, the loss of access and the development and coming into a modern economy where you have cash and subsistence. And you want to maintain hunting and gathering, you have to pass on those traditions. And as people go to the grocery store more than they hunt or fish or gather, you start to kind of erode the passing on of traditions and the knowledge of harvesting and processing those foods. And so regaining access to that knowledge and that experience where young people are learning and able to confidently get access to those resources after those traditions have been lost or have not been passed on is another kind of vulnerability.
I know we heard this from Ruby before, but Ruby is a social scientist. Lauren is a marine biologist. And so I wonder what she thinks some of the community's biggest food security challenges are. If we take both perspectives together, perhaps we get a somewhat complete picture.
Some of the biggest challenges around food security that the community is facing, I think, center around lack of access to resources. And that's because the resources like fish, crab, marine mammals, all of these marine seabirds, these are species that migrate in and out of the region. They're seasonal. They might be around the islands for summer foraging or winter foraging and overwintering, or for having their young. They might just be passing through, and so we see them, on their northward and southward migrations. But typically the seasonality and the timing of these resources, these animals, have been very consistent. And what we're seeing is a total unpredictable, lack of seasonality now. And things are shifting so quickly and disappearing in some cases, just totally disappearing. And that is really hard for the community because you expect those resources to be around in certain times and you plan for that. And there's also this general decline, in the number of species. So as northern fur seals, for example, decline in population, there are just less available to people. It is not at all related to the harvest of northern fur seals by the community, but simply seeing the decline instills this desire to do what you can control, which is controlling their own behaviors, right? And just to reduce the amount of harvesting or not harvest northern fur seals. And I think some of the other hard challenges are we have these really long supply lines for groceries in the grocery store. We can't get access to a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, produce, those kinds of things. And so people tend to get really comfortable with convenience foods, something like a frozen pizza or a frozen dinner or ready-made meals, canned vegetables, canned goods, things that are preserved. And those are quite convenient. And once you get used to that quick access to food, it's really hard to think about going back and investing time, energy, money into harvesting, hunting, fishing, especially when those activities are taking more time, they're getting more expensive, and they're really becoming unpredictable in how successful you'll be.
So let's hold on to this. The St. Paul Island community mostly relies on two things for its food security: the Aleut community store and the different subsistence species. So while food prices at the store have increased, many species have declined, and both threaten the local food security of the people who rely on them. But what is causing these declines?
We're experiencing a lot of wildlife declines around the islands, partially due to environmental changes that are happening around climate change. We know that sea surface temperatures are getting warmer. Even the bottom waters, where a lot of our ground fish, like halibut, are occupying, those are getting so much warmer that they are forcing animals to migrate or move long distances to try to find cooler waters. This is really well seen in some crab species that have virtually disappeared from the Bering Sea. They are highly mobile species. They're constantly looking for a preferred temperature, which is cold water. And we have a lack of cold water in the Bering Sea because of warming in general, due to climate change in Alaska over the Bering Sea. And so we had a complete crash and failure of two crab species, red king crab and snow crab, which are very important to our community. And we're seeing it with fish species. We're seeing it with marine mammals. Their species are moving temporarily, permanently. They're showing up where they shouldn't be. They're not showing up where they should be. And it is also due to things like prey availability. So marine mammals eat fish species. We know what they eat. We are used to having high abundances of what they eat around the islands. But when we have high harvest of those species for commercial purposes, right? We're operating commercial fisheries, some of the largest in the world, and the quotas for those fisheries are quite high. And they're very much taking those resources from around the Pribilos, which is where our marine mammals, whales, species would be feeding, seabirds especially. And so that's forcing the animals to travel further to find food, which is a lot more energetic, demanding on the individuals of the species, and then just as on the population as a whole. It's just not, you don't have enough food to feed everyone, basically. And so prey availability and competition with commercial fisheries, basically, these large scale extractive competitions is another contributor to the decline. There's other things like disease and contaminants and so pollution, marine debris. Sometimes animals are entangled. We don't know what entanglement rates are out in the ocean, because if they're getting entangled and dying at sea, we have no way of tracking them. There's a number of other factors that I things certainly play in, but the biggest ones that are really impacting, I would say, are related to climate change and environmental changes. Just the ecosystem is changing too quickly, and the competition for prey and for resources.
You have to imagine that. Indigenous communities have relied on their surrounding ecosystems for thousands of years. And then suddenly, global stakeholders who are also interested in the resources these ecosystems provide appear. But the difference is that these stakeholders want to feed not only their families, but the entire world. In the next episode, we dive deeper into the history that brings us to where we are today. But before that, I want to know from Lauren if she has seen any changes in her time on St. Paul Island that she is concerned about.
I have two. The two things that I have really noticed are northern fur seals and seabirds. So my first year on St. Paul was in 2012, and it was right after a particularly cold and hard winter. And 2011, 2012 is often referred to as the last kind of large ice year. It had a lot of sea ice come through in the winter, which is fantastic for the ecosystem, for the pribilofs, and we have not had in recent years. But my first year, I remember commenting to one of our island sentinels, Paul Malvidov, about how many fur seals there were around, and it was beautiful to me. I'm looking out on this haul out, and it's a sandy, beachy area that kind of looks like a little cove or a little bay on a beautiful island, and everything is green, but the beach is covered in these animals, and these northern fur seals, and they're lounging around and flipping their flippers. Like, it's just a beautiful sight to me. And I remember he kind of commented on the lack of fur seals that we were looking at. He was quite sad. He saw a very different picture. He said, no, the beach used to be black with animals. You know, you wouldn't even be able to see the sand. And he kind of painted this picture of how many more there used to be. And he was really sad, you know, and said, I can't, it just looks like there's none. And to me, it looked like there were so many. Well, I just spent my summer on St. Paul this year for my 11th year, and I had the exact kind of recounting that he had to me over 10 years ago when I brought some people that had never been to the island, and they were commenting on the number of fur seals on this same beach. And all I could see was there are virtually none. They're virtually gone. Where are all the fur seals? Where have they all gone? And so just in my 10-ish years, I have seen this huge decline. And then thinking about that with Paul, who's lived his entire life, you know, over 6 decades on the islands, just thinking about the decline that he's seen, as you can really see how, you know, shifting baselines can really make a difference based on your own experiences in history. But then the other example is least auklets, or chukchis as they're called. They used to nest in the boulders of St. Paul along these rocky shorelines, and you would see swarms of them traveling, and they were actually really easy to hunt with bamboo sticks. So you just sat in the rocks, and then you could kind of smack them out of the sky with a stick. You just hit them with a stick and harvest them. And they are all but gone. I mean, it's so rare to see a chukchi or at least auklet on some of the bouldery areas that they used to just swarm on. And it's so disappointing to see that kind of change over such a short time.
This is so depressing. I am not surprised, though. I read everything I could find about St. Paul before I first came here. I read about northern fur seal populations so big that you can't see the beach. Reports of thousands and thousands of birds. The Galapagos of the North, they said. And all this didn't really fit the reality that I encountered here. Sure, there are seals, there are birds, and all that is impressive and beautiful, but it's just not the way it used to be. And to hear that from someone who has been researching these ecosystems for years just hits differently. I'm beginning to doubt whether our project can really change anything. whether a better future is possible.
I think that projects like this are super important, and they're very timely because it helps build out a network of support around the community. The community is in place, they're on the ground, they're experiencing these changes and these impacts to their food security, and it is not something that's easily tackled. And having the experience and expertise and willingness of others to come in and help work with the community to recognize the issues, identify the issues, put maybe some words and names and process to the experiences that we know tribal members are having, but maybe can't identify or communicate well. Outside of the community, it's super helpful. It brings attention to the issues. It helps us with achieving success in getting funding to address some of these issues. It helps us prioritize and look at what is possible, what's feasible, what is outside of our control, what are things that we can influence, what is the community feeling, we can articulate that better, and then we can start to look at solutions for addressing that in a very prioritized, focused way. And given the rate of change of the environment, it is so important to do this work as quickly as we can, and thus having access to such amazing partners and a network of support where you have expertise and experience coming in to help guide the work is incredibly, incredibly helpful.
So maybe it is possible after all. A better future, I mean. We just have to create a more positive vision and believe in it. Only then can we make the right decisions and initiate the pathways to this vision becoming our reality. And isn't that what Ine said too? We only see the tip of the iceberg yet. The struggles, the problems. If we tackle those, that would be too easy. And it wouldn't change the root causes of these problems. We need to uncover what's beneath the surface. We need to understand what led to these problems.
The present emerges from the past. So many things happened in the past, many events, whether they were enjoyable or whether they were very negative, they really shaped people's beliefs, they shaped people's values, and they shaped their behavior, so how people behave today in the current system. So to understand the current system, you really need to understand what it emerged from.
This is what we focus on in the next episode. We are going on a journey through time. A journey through the past of St. Paul Island that will make us understand how we ended up here, in the present. This was Tipping the Iceberg. The show is brought to you as part of my PhD project at Utrecht University in the Netherlands and was created in collaboration with the Inuit community of St. Paul Island. If you liked this episode, please leave a review or share it with a friend. Idea and realization, Silja Zimmermann. Edit and production, Wiebe de Jong. Recording, Sebastian Reinartz. The artwork for the logo comes from Lydia Dirks. As an outsider, a white young woman from Germany, I am conscious of the profound wounds that colonization inflicted upon indigenous communities all over the world. I step onto St. Paul Island with deep respect, profound humility, and an earnest desire to understand and learn, not impose. The generosity of the Inuit community in sharing their wisdom is a privilege, not a right, and I'm ever thankful for this opportunity to listen and to learn.